Everybody's Dr. Eric Balkovich. We're back for another edition of the Thyroid Answers Podcast. We have another guest today. Her name is Janette Yee. She is a perinatal athletic therapist, and many of you may be going, what does that even mean? But we met at a recent conference. We talked about what she does in her cesarean recovery program, and it was like it was a great conversation. And I thought, man, this is something that we really don't pay attention to. And there's probably so many women who've had C-sections, a lot of women who've had childbirth and are struggling with the impacts of both having a baby naturally, having a baby via C-section, never fully recovering from that. So I thought Janette would be a great person to bring on the podcast and talk about the subjects, because it's not something we've talked about in the past. And I'm sure there's a lot of women, especially today. I think it's even, we're actually talking about women's pelvic issues even more. So without any further ado, Janette, welcome to the Thyroid Answers Podcast. How are you today?
Oh man, Eric, so good. I'm so glad to be connecting again after all this time.
Yeah. So let's do this. Let's give us your background, explain what a perinatal athletic therapist is and how you got into it. But give us a little bit of your background first, and then transition into how you got into doing what you're doing.
What is a perinatal athletic therapist, Eric? That's such a good question because, quite frankly, I made up that term because there's no such thing as a person a professional that takes someone who has given birth and rehabilitates them back into active, healthy living. There's no word for that professional, is there? It's so crazy. If you think about it, it's like, well, doesn't every human after giving birth kind of want to do that? But if they do, then who do they search for? There's no word for that, Eric. It's so unfortunate. So yeah, and you're nodding because you're like, yeah. What do we Google?
Don't we often make up the things that explain what we're doing? Like we make up terms to describe, we call a condition based on somebody's symptoms. Because, okay, you have fibromyalgia. Well, what is that? Well, that's an accumulation of these symptoms and we're going to give it a name, right? So we're always doing that. In my world, people always come and they say, so what's wrong with me? I have a thyroid problem, and I have adrenal problem, and I have a sex hormone problem. And I make up my own term in the book. And for my clients, like, you have a multi-system adaptive disorder. You have excessive stress on your physiology. It's causing your physiology to adapt from what we call homeostatic, low stress regulation, high stress, allostatic regulation. And as a result of that, we're going to have adaptive changes that often cause symptomatology and sometimes altered function and physiology. So we should expect that multiple systems under that stress load are going to become a challenge, right? Under chronic stress, hormones become dysregulated, gut becomes dysregulated. We have insomnia, we have anxiety, we have depression. We consider all those things that happen dysfunctions, but many times initially they're the adaptations to the excessive stress load. And really what allopathic medicine often does is just treat the adaptation as a disease, versus what we should be doing from a functional medicine approach is saying, okay, these are all appropriate responses given the situation. Now we have to figure out what's creating this to occur. So I don't think it's a bad thing for you to make up a term for something that we need and nobody really had a term for before. But I think it's great that you're doing it. So now let's get into why you are helping people and you had to make up this term.
Right. Well, so my background training is in sports orthopedics. So 21 years as an athletic therapist working with elite level sports teams, specifically women's rugby. And I know when you and I were talking when we first met, you're like, what? Women's rugby, eh? Is that like, okay, so that's a thing. So it's kind of interesting because, when we talk about elite sport performance, we equate that with international level, whatever, rugby, for example, or pro sport or whatever. How I got into working specifically with pregnant people and then more specifically post C-section is because of my sports background. I'm like, yeah, rugby is probably the toughest sport anyone can play. A little biased because I played it for 15 years, But I got to tell you something, Eric. The reason why I'm focusing on the specifically C-section um, uh, group of athletes is because there is no sport tougher than pregnancy. I've gone through it twice. I've played, I can't tell you how many rugby games. I would rather play a full weekend of some rugby tournament than be pregnant again because it is so tough. So, to position pregnancy as a sport is huge. And then to position childbirth as a season ending injury was also huge. For me, this kind of came up organically because while working with my athletes, before any of us had kids or had ever been pregnant, we just don't know what we don't know. You study all kinds of sports injuries in school, like how to rehab when the bone's sticking out of your face, how to, all these things where you're like, oh, okay, this might happen, and I hope it doesn't, but I know how to deal with it. Well, what about that one injury that happens to, okay, so 50% of the world is female or childbearing bodies. Each of those childbearing bodies might have a pregnancy, two pregnancies, three pregnancies, and of those, a lot of those will birth as well. How many millions of those injuries happen? And we learned about childbirth in athletic therapy school. Like we didn't know about it as an injury. We didn't know about it as how to rehabilitate from it. C-sections, definitely didn't mention those. Yet, C-sections are the most common surgeries, major surgery in the world. In the world. So in my background as an orthopedic therapist going, wait a minute, okay, here are my athletes now. We're all starting to have kids. They're all asking me, Janette, I'm pregnant. Can I still deadlift 300 pounds in the gym? It's like, I don't know. There's no research on that. Janette, I just had a C-section. What the F do I do? Because I want to get back to, national level sprinting again or whatever. What do I do? Because my doctor said, well, do nothing for 6 weeks. And then now you're cleared for activity. The reason, sorry, go ahead.
Which would be kind of like, hey, I tore my hamstring, just rest it, and then go right back to playing rugby again, right? The likelihood
exactly.
that's going to happen, and you can see professional athletes. I mean, and we both have experience playing rugby and potential and playing at higher level, and the intensity of the sport. If you had like a hamstring tear, which I've had, and you didn't do anything and you didn't recover and you just waited 6 weeks and got right back on the field, not only would you likely re-injure that hamstring again, right? But you'd likely have more significant injuries elsewhere because everything else would have to be overly stabilizing to try and guard for that injury, right? So and when we had that discussion about this at the conference, when you frame this all as, hey, going through a pregnancy, and obviously as a dude, I don't go through a pregnancy. I have a little contribution there, a small one, but we really don't consider it like an athletic event, which you think about it, this is like essentially you're putting your body into this position for 9 to 10 months. And then you have this climax of stress at the end, whether it's natural childbirth or a C-section, right? And most, I would argue that like your athletes probably were in much better shape many times heading into a pregnancy, maybe not. But the average person, especially in today's world, who's carrying extra weight, who doesn't do a lot of physical activity and training, and really focused on strength, stability, mobility, flexibility, they're really at a disadvantage going into the pregnancy. Is that fair?
That's fair. And, not to fearmonger or anything, because I love to say, the human body is just incredible at adapting. Like whether or not we go into pregnancy strong, whether or not we go into childbirth strong. Obviously, it's, you have an advantage if you do go into either one strong. But I do want to back it up and just kind of highlight the fact that a lot of folks, they focus on the pregnancy and the childbirth, but I gotta say, that's just the beginning. Man, you got some rehab set out ahead of you, plus a variable, a wild card that most other athletes don't have to contend with, which is a newborn. You ever try to rehab your ACL while raising a newborn? It's harder. You're not sleeping at the very least. And with your work with thyroid research, etc., we all know if you're not sleeping, you really start at a disadvantage for all kinds of healing, right?
Right.
So the reason why I got into this work is specifically at this. The first, she was a friend of mine. She was one of the first ones of us who went through getting pregnant and then having babies. But she was the first one who had a cesarean that went wrong, Eric. And I remember she came back. She was a national level sprinter for Canada, and she had an emergency cesarean, which was in and of itself so emotionally traumatic. Because she's like, my body failed me. It has never failed me on the track. How come I can't give birth? I'm a woman. I'm designed to do this. And all of these self-shaming beliefs that happen very, very often. And the reason why I'm bringing up this is very important. I'll come back to it in a minute. But 6 weeks of doctors saying, don't lift anything heavier than your baby, don't do anything at all other than that. After 6 weeks, you're clear to go. She took that bill of health at the 6-week mark, and do you know what she did? She did, and she's like, okay, I'm going to ease back into it. Doctor never asked her, however, what her easy workouts were, what it meant to her to ease back into it. So as a national level sprinter, her first workout back was an easy 5K run. Let me tell you, after major abdominal surgery, there's nothing easy about a 5K run. As a matter of fact, it hurt her. She got injured. And it wasn't like she didn't know she was hurting. She went out and she had to get back. So she doubled up on that injury. She was set back by a good 8 weeks for her rehab. She was in severe pain after that. Long story short, I'm going back to the emotional part because not only did she start with, my body failed me, I couldn't give birth, quote unquote, naturally. Listeners can't see I'm using air quotes. But now she's like, now I can't do anything. I'm a piece of garbage. I listen to my doctor. I'm so mad at my doctor. I followed his orders and I'm in horrific pain now. I did what I was told. This is not fair. And that my baby's not sleeping. My partner's not helping me the way I need. I listened to Janette and that failed too. And it was at that moment, in that one instant, Eric, where I was like, I need to commit my orthopedic training to this. If this happened to my friend, is this happening anywhere else in this world? And unfortunately, yes. Yes, it was. And yes, it continues to be. And that story was from 2006. That was almost 20 years ago. It's still happening around the world. That's not okay.
And I'm sure it is. And that's why there's a greater discussion today, maybe about pelvic floor issues and women having all the struggles they have today that maybe we weren't even talking about, 5 years ago, let alone a decade or two ago. So let's start with what are the unique stresses and challenges put on the pelvic area, the physiology in general? We don't have to get into the chemistry, but definitely from a musculoskeletal standpoint that somebody goes through as they're going through a pregnancy. Let's talk about maybe some of those things first, and then we'll talk about the impact of birth and especially C-section, and then what really needs to be done. But what are the really unique challenges for somebody as they're going through pregnancy that's really going to put stress and strain on that whole kind of core area?
Well, for a lot of listeners, I want to define what the pelvic floor is in the first place. Because if anyone's like me and I do this work, and I went to school and I never learned about the word pelvic floor after coming out of orthopedics for 4 years. We all need to understand But the pelvic floor is a bunch of muscles. It's a bunch of muscles between your legs. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So, but it's also an important part of our core. And when I say core, I like to use the analogy of a house, like a powerhouse. Like without your core, like that's your powerhouse. That's where your power comes from. So just like a house, your pelvic floor is a bunch of muscles. That would be the floor of the house. But then you got like muscles for the walls of that house, and those are your transverse abdominis muscles. Okay, a bunch of other stuff in the back. And then for the roof of this powerhouse, you got your respiratory diaphragm. Okay, your breathing muscle. Now I know you asked me about the pelvic floor, but guess what? That pelvic floor, it never functions in a silo. It has to work with its buddies, the wall and the roof. Has to. So, what happens during pregnancy to the pelvic floor? If one can imagine, okay, well, the powerhouse, how does that powerhouse change during pregnancy? For all the listeners here, you can probably make a very educated guess. The whole darn thing changes. The house gets stretched out of some crazy shapes and then comes back over the course of 9 months out, 9 months in, right? So let's call it whatever, 2 years. But that is a massive adaptation. So what happens to that pelvic floor is it is at the very least strain to hold everything that's supposed to be in. Right. It is working so damn hard. It's a bunch of muscles, and the muscles are working real darn hard to hold everything in. The research kind of shows that the pelvic floor goes under after childbirth. It shows that the pelvic floor is like 25% weaker. I'm using quotations again. Dysfunction is probably a better term, but that also doesn't mean anything. People can refer to or understand this, what weakness might mean. Although the cause is different, we don't have to go into in depth about that. But if it's 25% weaker through pregnancy alone, well, we gotta do something about that, because
and that doesn't even take into consideration their starting point, right? Like how strong and stable was that to begin? That's just 25%, not from 100%, but that's 25% from wherever they're starting, their conditioning when they start, right?
And Eric, it doesn't take into consideration the type of birth. I'm just saying pregnancy alone challenges that pelvic floor strength by 25%. It ends up weakening by that much. So if we're talking about a vaginal birth afterwards, we got some direct acute trauma. Mm-hmm. We do, quote unquote, natural or not. And I keep using the word natural with quotes because there's nothing unnatural about the other kind of birth then, therefore the C-section. It's not unnatural. I don't want everyone thinking, oh, one's normal, one's not. So that's not what the word natural is. That's not how Eric and I are using this term right now. But with a vaginal birth, if you're going to experience some very big acute trauma directly on that pelvic floor, in addition to that 25% weakness from pregnancy. Okay, so now that pelvic floor has got to keep everything in. It's got to act like a sump pump, where there's a lot of swelling that happens during pregnancy. There's a lot of swelling that happens after a medicated birth. Okay, so anyone's using an epidural, certainly after a C-section, like a cesarean is a surgery. You need that sump pump to pump up that swelling. Your sump pump ain't working, right? It's a place for pleasure too. Well, no one's thinking about, oh my God, intimacy after a traumatic birth, after birth, period. But at some point, most folks want to get back to that, right? Yeah. And there are a couple other functions of the pelvic floor, but your question was, well, what happens to that pelvic floor during? Well, in a very easy answer, it weakens by 25% during pregnancy. That's just a very Googleable textbook answer, right?
So we could think like all that musculature gets stretched out. It's like the collar of your t-shirt, right? That initially when you have it, it's brand new, it's nice and tight, it looks good. And then after wearing it a bit, get washed a bit, it gets getting kind of stretched out, doesn't lay nice. And it loses its elasticity, its motility, its ability to kind of shrink back in and maintain form. We can kind of say when we go through pregnancy, we kind of stretch all that musculature out. There's some injury that's occurring, just not necessarily injury, but change in the tissue that's occurring through the development or through the whole process of pregnancy. And even then we have the trauma of going through childbirth in whatever direction it goes. And we're going to have some injury and scar tissue from that. And the assumption is that it's just going to go back to normal, right? And the reality is for most people, it may not go back to normal without some type of reconditioning and retraining. Mm-hmm. Is that fair?
That's totally fair. And I want to highlight for any listener who's thinking of, oh my God, my vagina is like Eric's collar. He's showing me this collar still stretched out. It's never coming back. So I want to highlight that unlike the collar of Eric's mm-hmm. shirt, the human body is capable of more adaptation than we could possibly imagine. It is your superpower. For anyone who's listening going, oh shoot, I'm all stretched out. It's under load. Okay. It's not mm-hmm. stretched out in the sense that, okay, it's like a piece of material, it's damaged. No, it's under load. So may I give a different kind of analogy?
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
Let's do that. Because for a lot of folks who've ever done any kind of weightlifting in the gym, okay, so like, let's just take arm curls. Everyone's done an arm curl, right? The pelvic floor during pregnancy is like this. Okay, so everybody can probably arm curl a pound. Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's say you're pregnant, your uterus gains 1 pound in size and fluids and babies. It's still a tiny, tiny little zygote, by the way. We're not even counting how much the baby weighs, mm-hmm. but it's a pound. So your pelvic floor is doing this, okay? But you got a pound on it, okay? So if your pelvic floor is the bicep, that's how much load it's under, okay? But all day long, you're doing this as you're holding this 1 pound, okay? And then your uterus gets a little bigger, then it's 2 pounds, then it's 3 pounds, then it's 4 pounds. So your body's slowly adapting. You can handle it probably. Biceps, mm-hmm. maybe not the best analogy because your biceps totally different. It's not designed and it's not an endurance muscle. But mm-hmm. the idea is this: you think 5 pounds, you can lift 5 pounds, but if you're doing 5 pounds for 9 months, by the way, it's not just 5 pounds, it's a lot of load. And your bicep can adapt to a certain point, but at the end of the day, it's going to be like, I am tired, Janette. I'm tired. You birth your baby, you take that 5 pounds out of your hand. Okay, so here's our analogy. Your bicep isn't going to just suddenly be like, oh, thanks, good to go. All right, I'm good to go. No, it's going to take a little time for it to even be like, to relax again. Mm-hmm. It's going to take some time for it to, and even during pregnancy, it's under so much load. It's not strong. It's just freaking tired. So I mm-hmm. want people to hear your pelvic floor isn't weak during pregnancy. That's why I was quoting, I'm saying it's a very layman's term to say your pelvic floor is weakened by 25%. The reason why it feels weak is because it's so damn tired from working out for 9 months. You got to give it a period of rest. Okay. And then you have to tell it to retrain. You got to retrain it. And if you had a vaginal birth, the analogy might be not just, I took the 5 pounds out of your hand, but I'm fighting with you now for that 5, like childbirth, it's traumatic. I am fighting you for that 5 pounds. You're trying to hold on to, or whatever. And now your bicep is actually injured. Mm-hmm. Okay? And now you have to rehab that bicep. You got to teach it to be, hey, it's safe to be at a full length and tension again, but we also got to train it how to go back all the way to full bending again. It's got to go through that full range, but you ain't going to start right like that from the get-go. It's going to take a couple of weeks, months of slow, progressive rehabilitation until it starts to look like exercise again. It starts to look like an arm curl again, and it starts to feel like an arm curl. You feel strong, you feel confident doing it again. So that's a process. And certainly, I mean, we could talk about cesarean in a second, because the biggest myth, Eric, is that folks who have a cesarean, they go, oh, well, at least my vagina was saved. Mm-hmm. It's not. So we can talk about that in a second. But like, does that make sense? That kind of like the adaptation of the pelvic floor through pregnancy and through birthing?
I think that's I think it's understandable for most people. I mean, I think everybody can understand that when they, especially from a bicep perspective, when you hold something for an extended period of time, it's the tension over time that really is the exhausting piece.
Yeah, that causes the weakness. Right.
Right. And if you're doing bicep curls, sure, you give it you take a break at your set, and you're able to go back and do it again. The problem from what you're saying is that for women, unless they're actively allowing for rest, recovery, they're under chronic load all the time through the pregnancy.
Perfect.
And not really
Yes.
considering the fact that I really need to take time to take the load off of this pelvic floor and this muscle and this tissue to just give it some recovery from day to day. I mean, we lay down, but there are probably things that you would probably recommend, and we'll talk about those maybe closer to the end, that somebody who is pregnant should be doing on a consistent basis to unload the tension and relax that tissue so it has its ability to get back into its more plastic environment where it has the ability to relax, to contract. And the rest and recoveries period, a really, really important piece. So we'll get back to that. But I think the analogy works really well. So we talk about that there's chronic stress and tension on this pelvic musculature, the abdominal musculature. Obviously, all that stuff attaches to the lumbar spine, and that affects the rest of the body, right? Then we have gait changes and all of this stuff that occurs through pregnancy. But we're going to kind of move forward because today we're on a little bit of a shorter time frame, and I want to make sure we get all these highlights in. And let's talk about first what types of challenges, unique challenges occur when somebody goes through, let's say, like a regular vaginal delivery that can really create a little bit more injury potentially and weakness that we need to keep in mind. And then we'll shift into the more, okay, now what's going on that's more problematic potentially from a cesarean section. So let's talk about natural childbirth and the unique things that need to be considered from an injury and recovery standpoint with a traditional vaginal delivery.
Let's talk about a textbook vaginal delivery. Textbook. And when I describe this injury, and it is an injury, I want everyone to listen to this. If you had a vaginal birth, it was an injury. Yeah, probably healed from it, but it might not be recovered. And healing and recovery is very different from an orthopedic standpoint. But listen, what happens is during a textbook vaginal birth, the whole vagina has to open up large enough to allow the passage of a full-term baby through. Full-term baby is anywhere from like 5 pounds to like 9 pounds. My firstborn, 5 pounds, 13 ounces. And let me tell you, it didn't matter that she was quote unquote on the small end of the scale. It was still a lot of vaginal trauma. Okay. So I want everyone to listen to this. The textbook vaginal birth is the whole vagina has to accommodate for passage of another human being. You will at the very least stress that muscle. It will not just stretch, it will strain. What does strain mean? There are tears to the musculature. Your musculature will tear. Microscopically, right? If we're talking about whatever, 10% of those muscle fibers, same thing. If you go for a workout, your muscles are going to be sore the next day, right? Because you tore some muscle fibers. That's how you grow back stronger. Well, a vaginal birth, you're tearing probably more than that. I don't know the exact percentages, Eric, don't quote me on it. But it tears so much, it's no longer just an adaptation to get stronger. It's now past that threshold. It is now an injury. You've torn more than the vaginal, all the pelvic floor muscles can do simple daily functions. Okay, so at the very least, it's going to be hard to keep your pee in. Okay, let's just go through a checklist. So for any mom who's listening to this, there might be chuckling and laughing, going, yeah, for sure. I was peeing myself for the first 2 days. I didn't even know. Okay, you don't know because, yes, the muscles are so stressed. They're probably strained, i.e. they're torn. So there's no connection. You can't even contract it at will. So second point to that is there's a neurological deficit too, right? Due to pain alone, you'll be too afraid to contract the muscles that you need to hold your pee in. Okay, that's pain science. That's a different discussion. But so there's fear that is going to impact your pain and your function. And then there is going to be actual neurologically a big challenge to connect the brain to those muscles. They're just so traumatized. It's literally your brain's like, shut her down. From a safety standpoint, Janette, You are not going to use your vagina. It is just not going to work. And you're going to be like, okay, cool. I'm just going to like sit and not do anything because that's what your body wants you to do. Do nothing.
Mm-hmm.
P.S. I'm still talking about a textbook vaginal birth. This is still just normal, easy peasy birth. Okay. So at the very least, those three things are going to happen. You're going to be too afraid to move. You physically can't control those muscles, and you're going to have symptoms like incontinence, like just peeing yourself. And then the fourth thing that is actually quite common is an actual visible tear. Okay. It's going to look like a nick. Who's ever seen their vaginas, it's going to look like a small nick. But anybody's envisioning a nick in their vagina probably causes a little bit of fear and just, you're a little concerned about a small nick in your vagina. Some folks will tear enough to need stitches as well. Bottom line, there's scar tissue.
Mm-hmm.
You tear anything and any amount, there's going to be scar tissue. Okay. And that is like the bare minimum that will happen during a textbook vaginal birth. Two pushes, you're out. That's a textbook vaginal birth at the very least. Those symptoms I described will happen for anywhere from 2 days to 6 weeks.
Now you have somebody who doesn't have a 2 push and you're out, right?
Mm-hmm.
Let's we'll highlight some of the challenges that may occur there as well. Just a greater level of injury potentially, right?
Yes, exactly. Those 4 things I just listed, you would magnify them. So they're all in a continuum, aren't they? So when we talk about fear, you're probably going to be a lot more fearful for so many other reasons, right? Because now you have, let's say, an actual larger tear, first, second, third degree, fourth degree tear, like an actual tear. The grades describe how much of the actual musculature is torn towards the anus. It's in the perineum. Of course, that affects function. If you can imagine a full tear all the way to your anus, you're going to have fecal incontinence as well. Forget the pain. The pain is going to be a lot more than just, quote unquote, just a first degree tear. But functionally, you're looking at a much longer rehabilitation, right? There's going to be stitches. There could be complications with infection. You will have to take care of your stitches. So there's another added layer of, oh, I'm scared. Oh, this hurts. Oh, right? Function-wise, you have to reconnect your brain, not just to your vagina now your anus, now your urinary system, all of these things. And you have to start to rehabilitate that on a different level, right? It's going to be slower, but it's going to be much more involved and arguably much more important because it won't just heal on its own. It won't. Right?
Do you see the women that are being snipped to create more space? Do they have a tendency to have more challenges than the women who tear naturally?
So first, I'm going to stay my lane and say I do not work with many vaginal birth moms to be able to have a professional statement on your question. However, a surgical snip, the argument of actually having, it's called an episiotomy to any of our listeners here. The reason for an episiotomy is so that the idea was so the surgeon can guide a tear in a better direction. Obviously, if you're going to tear, you don't want to tear into, let's say, right into the anus, like causing potentially further problems. But a snip is still a snip. And snip means you're cutting muscles. It cut a muscle. Imagine you cut your bicep. That's a problem. That's a problem. Okay. Now, the reason why a surgeon might decide to do this because they think it's easy, like a controlled tear will be easier to fix. Again, listeners can't see me using quotes here, air quotes. Controlled meaning I'm controlling the direction and the depth of that tear, and also I can stitch up a clean incision easier than a rip. Right? That's the idea. Unfortunately, Eric, I can't quote to you the evidence and the results of a natural tear or a surgical incision in terms of recovery. That's just not my wheelhouse. There's plenty of research out there. I just can't speak to that at this moment.
So let's talk about now we have somebody who goes through a C-section What are the unique challenges that somebody experiences who by choice or by necessity has to go through a C-section procedure?
Okay. Are you talking psychologically? Are you talking physically? Are you talking pelvic floor? Are we answering all those questions?
I think we're gonna try and touch on all of those, like maybe high level, right? Because obviously
Okay.
we won't get through the complexity of this in the time we have left for today. But I want to, there's people might think, okay, a C-section is easier because they're not doing all the stuff that gets going through the pelvic canal. So this is going to be maybe an easier recovery, and I don't know that that's necessarily the case. I've never had childbirth myself, but my wife's been through 3 all natural births. But I don't think it's necessarily that. I don't know that one situation is necessarily better than the other. Everybody has choices to make. Sometimes you don't get to make a choice. It's kind of thrust upon you. But there's got to be some unique injury that occurs with somebody with a C-section, because we're cutting muscles. We're cutting different muscles. But that's really what I want to get to. What are the unique situations that occur from a C-section? We already know that, especially if you already kind of hinted on this a little bit. If you are planning on a birth and now you have to go through an emergency C surgery or a C surgery you weren't planning on, that creates a whole nother level of emotional component. But what's the physical change or difference in physical injury often with a C-section?
Okay, yeah, let's talk about just the physical part. But like you said, any unexpected surgery to any part of your body, man, that psychological component, it really does drive how well or not someone heals. It really, really does. So you're right. We could have a podcast about that alone, right? But
so I think we could have a podcast on just the emotional stress of having a pregnancy. I know how I was when I cracked the tooth. I was like, oh my gosh, thinking about all that. It was just cracked, and oh my gosh, now I have to do I have to take it out? Do I get an implant? I can't imagine for 9 or 10 months thinking I'm going to have to push this big object through this narrow opening. How is that going to occur? So I can't even imagine the emotional stress and trauma that a woman goes through in this process. So we'll try to keep that for now, that it's traumatic no matter what you're doing for 9 to 10 months thinking about the process. But let's talk about those unique physical challenges.
Yes. So with a cesarean, here's the thing. There are actually, let's call it 3 types of cesarean, and you kind of said it. So one is the emergency cesarean. You don't know that it's going to happen until it literally happens a second before. And in those cases, a woman has been laboring for any amount of time, right? So which means the trauma, the physical trauma that's unique to an emergency cesarean is that you might also have pelvic floor vaginal injury because you're laboring and pushing for gosh knows how long. The baby stuff got to get them out. Now they're cutting you open and now they're pulling the baby out the other way. Okay, so now you got 2x. Actually, yes. Actually, the mom I just saw today for rehab, that's exactly what happened to her. Her son was lodged in the whole birth canal and she pushed for 4 hours before they're like, heart rate's dropping, get him out. And from the time that is called, the time the emergency cesarean is it's happening, do you know there's only 10 minutes? You only have 10 minutes to get that baby out of your body. Can you imagine what is happening physically? The mother is being wheeled she's not in an operating studio, a surgical studio. She's being wheeled to gosh knows where as fast as possible, pile everything in. If she's got a partner, it's come or not. They're not even, it's get her, go. And she's going, what's happening to her? She might be put under. That might be the last thing she remembers before she goes under general anesthesia, before she wakes up with a baby in her arms. Okay. So imagine this, friends, imagine this. Your physical body is being prepped. I'm not a surgeon, but you gotta disinfect the area. The surgeons are putting on their all their gowns, they're getting ready. They are cutting her open as fast as carefully as possible, but with the emergency of get the baby out. Seconds matter. They're not worried about how clean is the incision. Is this going to look nice at the end when it heals? Cut, 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 pull, 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 open, out, out, out. In this case, for my client today that I saw, baby was lodged in the birth canal. So they're trying to pull the baby out, but the baby's in the uterus, yeah. They're pulling with the force of, if you can imagine anything was stuck in a hole that's too small, that's how hard those surgeons are pulling. But on a person who's open, like her entire body is cut wide open. She also then experienced a tear in her uterus because they had to pull the baby so hard. The good news at the end, everybody was okay. But the physical recovery from an emergency cesarean, Eric, is not the same as a planned cesarean at all. At all. It is much longer. And if anyone was listening to that story, I was stressed telling it. I didn't even experience that. The emotional load of that is unimaginable. You must acknowledge, one must acknowledge that and its role that it plays in the physical rehabilitation for the physical rehabilitation to be maximized or optimized. Okay. So that's one of three types of cesareans. Okay. The second type of cesarean is a unplanned cesarean. Essentially, it's and this happens to a lot of moms who are like, 36, 38 weeks pregnant, whatever, and they're like, guess what? Your baby's breech. They haven't spun around, so they're not locked and loaded. They're not down head first. So they're going in for an unplanned cesarean. They're not mentally like planning it. They're like, oh shoot, they have maybe 2 weeks to mentally, and physically maybe prep for it. But it's not the same as a physical injury like an emergency. But you're still having to contend with the emotional load. And then a planned cesarean is the most peaceful kind of surgery, I guess you can, out of the three. Yeah. But all of them requiring intentional physical rehabilitation for the abdominal wall. Think back to the original question of the pelvic floor. What is the pelvic floor? Well, it's part of the whole powerhouse. Well, now your powerhouse has been loaded on the floor by virtue of pregnancy alone. It's 25% weaker. But now the wall's been cut right open. What are you going to do now? Okay, so that, on a very big nutshell, that's what makes a cesarean rehab totally unique and different from a vaginal birth.
So how much time and attention, right, is really given in the, for women? I think we talked about this a little bit. It doesn't sound like there's much time and attention given to rehab. It's more just rest and recover. And gosh, I remember when we had our first child, my wife tore complete, this is personal information, but I guess I'll put it out there. She had a complete tear, right, for the first one. And they sent her home the next day with a baby. Like I left like within minutes of the delivery because I had to fly for state board exams. So I was flying, I was in a car and driving to Chicago airport to fly back to Pennsylvania. So I'm not there to help her. Fortunately, my mother-in-law was there. My sister showed up, but they sent her home the next morning with a baby and a carrier, and just like, you're going to carry it. And she's like this was not good. I don't think I should have been going home in a day. Now this was, it's 29 years ago and things have, I think, hopefully changed, but it was like, yeah, you had a baby. Yeah. So what? You tore, we stitched it up, go home, you're going to carry. And now she's got the responsibility of carrying and lugging a baby around and doing all the things you need to do. And, you don't really even think about just, imagine from a guy's standpoint, like just like we were talking about the hamstring, just imagine you tore your hamstring off and somebody stitched it back together. You probably wouldn't be carrying things around the house that day when you got home. You'd probably be laid up for a couple of weeks, leg rested in repair. And unfortunately, sometimes that just doesn't happen. So you see that there's more focus today on rehabbing these areas, or likely there still isn't, and that's why you're doing what you're doing.
You just asked the question and answered it all at once, Eric. No, you're totally right. There's a big challenge in public health care worldwide. There just is. With the thousands and thousands of women I've worked with and talked to, etc. Out of, I don't even know what the percentage is. Out of 1,000 people I talk to, maybe 5. I can't even tell you what the point is. It's very, very, very low, and completely a surprise when anybody ever comes to me and says, "Oh, my doctor said I should probably do some rehab after my C-section." It is such an outlier that I'm still surprised and so excited when I hear this. Mm-hmm. I guess the good news is some doctors are talking about it now, whereas before, really, it's not a thing. Now, this is no slag against any doctor, right? I think the doctor might have gone through the same kind of training I did in orthopedics, right? Through 4 years of schooling. No one ever no one told them, you gotta have to rehab after the surgery. They're busy trying to figure out how to do the darn surgery. They're not even surgeons. They're obstetricians. Yeah.
It's
right?
It's
so
not necessarily part of
surgery. It's not the
it's not part of what they've been trained to do, and it's more.
No.
It sounds bad, but it's ignorance, because they're not. It's not real. It's not like there's not a good doctor or a smart doctor, but it's not what they're really trained and focused on is the recovery. Their training and focus is on the delivery, and we could say they're not. If you're not trained on it, if you don't know the significance of it, then you're ignorant to the fact that this may need to go on. And so yes, there's definitely that. But you know what, Eric, the challenge is just how the whole public healthcare system is set up. Like there would be no doctor who would disagree with me if I said, "Hey, you know what, maybe like some rehab might be a good idea. What do you think?" I don't know any doctor who'd be like, "No, major abdominal surgery does not require any rehabilitation." Like I don't know any doctor who would actually state that and believe that. Okay. But, the harm is in the omission. Because if a doctor knows, or midwife, or whomever the primary care birthing person is, knows that, hey, whoa, your abdominals were cut, like your muscles were cut. Yeah, you can't get out of bed. You're in severe pain. You might want to do something about that. Just those very simple words plants the very necessary seed that crosses the path from ignorance to now curiosity. Yeah. For the mom, listen, at the end of the day, the mom absolutely still has to advocate for herself when it comes to postpartum recovery. She does. There is no city center in any part of North America that provides this, that I know of. Now, they're way more progressive in Europe, but I can't speak to their systems there. The point is, you need the rehab, but you're not going to get it from the hospital. Yeah, well, and I think that what you're leaning towards is the way the healthcare system is set up. This is not necessarily a medical necessity, and so therefore, maybe it's not going to be covered, and so it's, hey, this is not a crisis situation. This is not a necessity. You could do it. Maybe it's helpful, but it's not necessary. So therefore it's not covered. I know that's how things would work here in the States. Like, is it appropriate to have some type of pelvic rehabilitation post-surgery? Sure, it would be appropriate. Is it going to be covered by insurance? Well, it's not medically necessary at this point, so probably not. Right. So it doesn't become part of the standard procedure. It doesn't become part of the lexicon of the discussion around pregnancy. And I think that's where the issue really falls. And then people are thinking, oh, if my insurance company says it's not medically necessary, then I probably don't need it. Right.
And who defines necessity? Yeah. Right? No, so Eric, this is like another 9-hour podcast, but like when we philosophize about the challenges of how healthcare systems are currently set up, like someone has defined necessity, because let's just make a comparison. If anyone goes in for a knee replacement, whether in the States or in Canada, it is a necessity to get rehabilitation, because there must have been at least whatever studies that this necessity was based on to say the outcome is so poor without rehab that this person's health span is going to be severely impacted. Let's just leave it at that. Well, what if it's not a knee surgery and it's a abdominal surgery? We're just going to cut open your abs. Well, isn't that an orthopedic surgery? And what is the necessity of an abdominal muscle? Is it as important as a knee? Right? And then who's defining if that is important or not? And where are the studies that might need to be taking place for the insurance companies to go, holy God, there's people walking around with no abs. This is the problem. Wait, if she can't sit for the rest of her life, or if she's too scared to, what are her kids not doing? Because she can't, she can't bring them to activities, or she's too much in pain to go grocery shopping for fresh food, and then now her whole the outcomes are just it's ridiculous. Again, another podcast, but the health implications, the chronic health implications of an incomplete or improperly healed C-section, they're massive. They're massive, not just on the woman, but on everybody that woman cares for, because she physically is not going to be able to do it for at least years. At least.
Yeah.
Listen, at least.
Long term, I mean, even from an insurance standpoint, the long-term health complications are going to be bigger down the line. Now,
yes,
they may be thinking, well, we'll kick that can. Somebody else is going to, they may be on a different insurance. It'll be somebody else's responsibility, but ultimately we're not taking a look at it. And I'm not aware of how much research is done for any type of abdominal surgery, let alone a cesarean section, and what the outcomes are. And, that would obviously, somebody would have to spend a bunch of money to do those studies and do those outcomes. And obviously maybe they have been done, but there's usually a financial interest in the background. Like, what do we gain from doing this? And not necessarily from the patient standpoint of gain, but from the industry standpoint of gain, unfortunately, sometimes. So, Janette, we're barely scratching the surface. We didn't even get into, okay, what should we be doing prepping for birth? What should we be doing from a recovery of birth? So what we're going to do is you're going to schedule another hour and a half, and we're going to talk about that. But I do want to finish today's podcast, because this one's going to go out as part one. I do want you to let people know, who are sitting at home going, I had a C-section, I had childbirth, I have pelvic floor, abdominal issues. I want to know more about this. Where can they find out more about you and your cesarean recovery program, so that if they're interested, like right after they hear this, they know where to go?
My website would be the best bet, JanetteYee.com, and there's courses that are self-paced about how to prep and recover from a cesarean. Now, I also live on Instagram, so Ask Janette is my handle. I fancy myself a content creator because it's fun to make videos about, education. How else are you going to find education? So I like personally watching videos. So you'll find me there. I make a lot of videos about C-section prep, C-section recovery. But the big take home I want everyone to hear is this: it's not too late. You might be months, years, heck, decades out of your C-section and be like, wow, I am experiencing chronic, low grade, but I do still have pain on my scar, my surgical area, or I'm still having painful sex. Did you know C-sections can cause that? Right? How about people are like, I can't even look at my own abdominals. I hate my scar. So that's the psychology of healing. All these things, friends, it's not too late. There's something. If you want to do something about these things, you absolutely can. All you need is a plan, and then you just got to follow it.
All right, that's awesome. So for the listeners, it's askjanette.com, or is that what's the website again?
Website is my name, JanetteYee.com.
Okay.
Instagram
and the
and
IG
TikTok
handle is
Ask Janette. Yeah.
All right,
Ask
awesome.
Janette.
And you promise you'll schedule for the second half of this, right?
I promise.
Okay.
I promise. I'll do it today. Eric. I swear.
So for the listeners, we had to reschedule this initially, and she had a shorter time frame. I still don't know if we would have even gotten finished in an hour and a half, because we're really just starting to scratch the surface. And I think this is so important to have a discussion about, that we're going to make sure she's back really pretty quickly. We'll try and get these maybe back-to-back episodes on the podcast. So Janette, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I'm so happy we got a chance to meet at the conference and have some lots of discussions. We wound up, hanging out most of the conference and having discussion, which was awesome. So I'm going to let you go, get back to your life, and then I look forward to having the follow-up conversation pretty quickly.
Thank you for holding space for such an important convo, Eric. I appreciate you.